So they would wear trousers like the Turks, which are albinos and come from Central Asia, and then also created the Ottoman Empire. And that's the reason for which most Arabs today are not Arabs but Turks, because the actual Arabs were Negroid and also had mixed, but many Arabs, like the Sheikhs here, are descendants of Turks and they said themselves. But anyhow, they were all the Turks, all the Central Asian albinos who tamed the horse. The horse was tamed in Central Asia. I'm not sure if it was the albinos, Dravidian albinos like me, who tamed the horse first, but I know for sure that we were some of the first humans to tame it, and that especially the first humans to tame the horse were in Central Asia, and where the culture of falconry is and all it is not in the Arab world like here. It's where it originates from all these Mongolian plateau cultures, and also they all were wearing trousers because they were always on horseback, but the women were still wearing dresses like the rest of the world. So what one has to think is, until quite recently, until most of the rest of the world, it was not dress was a special thing to imprison a woman. No, dresses were not especially imprisoning. They became imprisoning later on during the Middle Ages in Europe to imprison women. That is true. But otherwise, like what Charlemagne is wearing there, what the Arabs are wearing today, or the Japanese are still wearing sometimes today, are not imprisoning at all. It's just like a big gown, like a big overcoat that would be closed. But it's not an overcoat. It is the man garment. And that was not, it was not a garment created to imprison women and honest women. It was more that it was a universal garment of everybody, but except if you were on horseback. So most cultures that had developed an actual civilization, unlike the illiterate, barbaric albinos, whom we are truly descendant of, and that's the reason for which we still all the culture of Europe, we appropriated as our own and cut down the noses of the statue, not to show that they are Negro, not to show that they were not us. We steal their past, because truly the albinos have no past except the past of an illiterate tribesman on horseback all day, and thus we were wearing trousers all day. Except the women were not on horseback. The women at that time, everywhere in the world, were slaves and being beaten and raped at home and enslaved, really, so they were wearing a dress because they were not on horseback. But in other cultures, obviously the Romans and all had horses and they were riding a lot, but not best of the time. So if you were on a horse, then you were wearing trousers. But most people, they had developed an entire civilization that did not depend upon basically being a nomad to a permanent, like they were in China or in Japan or whichever African countries, Congo, whatever. And so most people were wearing a sort of dress. And that was the thing. Until the albinos took control, not of the world, the Dravidian albinos. I will name it because also there are other albinos, like the Japanese had their own albinos and whatever, and they also mixed with us, we as albinos, the Dravidian albinos, the one we call Caucasians, whether they be Turks, whether they be Georgians, whether they be Russians, whether they be modern Arabs, especially for like Qataris, or whether they be Frenchmen like me, or Englishmen, or whatever. These people, they obviously took control of the world, but before taking control of the world, they took control of Britain, and then Europe, Western Europe at least, and then the whole of Europe simultaneously as the rest of the world. And that happened very recently. But in Europe, at least in Spain, and Spain was mixed, but you had a lot of albinos and all, and they began these ex-tribesmen that were began to farm, began to implement themselves with black people, except in Britain where they had genocided the whole of the black population back when it first came in the 4th century, or the 3rd century, no, the 4th century. From the 4th to the 8th century, or the 7th century, Britain was genocided. The original Britons were Negroid and black, were genocided by basically the Britons of today, but they were even whiter, because obviously there was a bit of a mixture, and they began looking like me. Actually, they were all redheads and all. Anyhow, then there was again a mixture, and then again a genocide later on in the, what I call it, in the religious wars, whatever. But anyhow, they began, as these tribesmen began not to be tribes anymore. And obviously Europeans are known for loving the horse. It still stays until today. They began to implement their fashions, not their fashion, their way of dressing, which was obviously in a short tunic, not a dress, and trousers, whereas people before that, at least in cold weather like Europe, or like in Britain, they would be wearing long undertrousers and a dress, except when they were riding. But most people were not riding, but the albinos, most of them were, and even when they were no longer, the men at least, they would still adopt that dress because their culture had been so based around it. Not just their culture, their entire evolution, because cultures change all the time. The British culture today is not the same than in the 70s, and it was not the same than in the 20s, but what I mean is very core of the evolution of what their parents, grandparents were doing and so on. And so they sort of kept that, and as it shows in the book, this began happening rarely with the Italians. The Italian nobility began to be mixed with Dravidian Albinoes instead of the original, or whatever they had in place then, Negro, or this dark, even if they looked like as a same phenotype, much darker, like swarthy and whatever. They began to take these ex-tribesmen that had become upper middle class, whatever, they began to make them nobles. And so fashion began in the, I think, 13th century, at least in Europe. In Europe it began, what do I mean by fashion? I mean something that, a dress which is really more there as a statement, but not even a statement of I am the priest, or I am the king, or I am the lord, but more a statement of simply, that is why I want to dress, because that is the fashion, and basically what would it mean? It means I am in the 1970s, so I dress like a punk because I want to say that to society. Or I am like a lot, I dress 1890s strict posh because I want to represent the banking industry of the capitalist 19th century. What is it you want to represent? Not an actual statement of, it is my position, I am being paid basically to dress like that. It is always the uniform like they had until then. And that was very implemented. It began obviously with the highest nobility, I think in Spain or Portugal, where I think these albinos have been implemented in the, because there in these countries most people were not albinos at all. They were swarthy or darker. Back then swarthy meant like a woolsmith color or a bit lighter or whatever. But you obviously had albinos, descendants of the Visigoths or whatever. And they would maybe start doing that on the pretext of fashion. They were actually implementing, starting as a plague to bring in their own culture, to replace theirs, replace their master's culture. And they began dressing for the first time in history, at least in Western Europe, and I think well in history or ever, not just history, not just within history, just ever in humanity, in tight tailored garments. And so tailors were a profession. Until then you had no tailors. You had cloth makers that would make clothing, but clothing had just to be, it was just where to cloth yourself. And if it was cold, one would ask, how could it belong if it was cold? How could it be voluminous? But then they would tighten it like this perfect example of the fake Viking here, whereby he wears these little strings of leather to tighten the voluminous cloth so he does not feel cold anymore, or at least not that cold. But otherwise he would let it go and look like Charlemagne in a voluminous dress, like a Turkish man or whatever. But for the first time, clothing was tailored. Also, initially it was extremely expensive, it was extremely new, it was like the most avant-garde modern thing ever, at least in terms of clothing. And so initially tailors would work only a 1 to 3 person. It would be entirely hand-measured, obviously, and it would be only the block of way of drafting. They had no drafting systems, or at least very primitive ones. And they did not begin to have formulas until the late 18th, well, early 19th century, after the Enlightenment period, where they began to elaborate mathematics and all. Back then it was very more of an art in that. It was very, like the stylist, like calligraphy, it was very, oh my lord, my king, my prince from Portugal, I will try to see what I will put that beautiful cloth around you which comes from China, which was the back then if a cloth in Europe came from China, and like today it meant it was super expensive because you had to import it and all. So it was very, transportation was not the same, and he would wrap it around him and see how he could tailor it on that unique body at that unique time, and not doing it without any formulas really, or his own formulas, and they would keep patterns secret, patterns, ways of making patterns extremely secret, from one master tailor who was made the master one, taking all the measurements, to from